read that. In fact, don't read any of the Sand County Almanac. But that's right, just go watch TV instead or something, or watch Miley Cyrus working. But no, it's heartbreaking, right? In 1905, how much wildlife Leopold and his brother observed when they went, right? The Colorado River flows into the Gulf of California, and it used to be this amazingly rich estuary, right? Biodiverse with pumas and just thousands and thousands of waterfowl, and that's what they described, right, when they went there. And now, of course, it's just a little trickle of chemicalized, and it's all just a big mud and nothing's there anymore. No more pumas, no more waterfowl, nothing. But no, the guy that I was thinking about, what was my question again? Oh, is Wallace Stegner. Wallace Stegner, okay? The greatest. I'm happy to say this. Certainly other people would agree. One of the greatest novelists of the 20th century is Wallace Stegner, whose Wilderness Letter I asked you to read for today's class. Okay? Wallace Stegner, great 20th century environmentalist, served on the board of the Sierra Club at the same time that William O. Douglas, in other words, in the 50s to the early 60s. Wallace Stegner served on the board of the Sierra Club director at the same time that David Brower was the executive director. Wallace Stegner was also professor of creative writing at Stanford University. And in that position, he taught virtually every famous Western writer, right? That went, the guy that wrote Lonesome Dove, Ken Kesey, but not the guy, Ken Kesey, and then the other guy that wrote Lonesome Dove, and a whole bunch of Western writers went through Wallace Stegner's creative writing program at Stanford University. So that's kind of where he made his home for most of his life. And but he wrote a book. If you want to read, I think the semi-autobiographical novel that he wrote, Big Rock Candy Mountain. Fantastic, fantastic. If you need some summer reading, read The Big Rock Candy Mountain. And then if you want to read his biography, he wrote mostly fiction, right? Wallace Stegner wrote mostly fiction, some of which was loosely autobiographical, like The Big Rock Candy Mountain. But he did write a little bit of history and nonfiction, and his most famous nonfiction book is called Beyond the 100th Meridian. And that refers to, as you move from east to west across North America, you get to about the 100th meridian, which is about in the middle of North and South Dakota. And everywhere east of the 100th meridian is okay for agriculture without any need to irrigate. Okay? It's all okay for wheat and all kinds of grain products, corn, all kinds of stuff can be grown, right, east of the 100th meridian, but everywhere west is dry with a few exceptions. Right, include, of course, here in Oregon, was one of those exceptions, Western Oregon, Western Washington. But anyway, it's a great book, and it includes an account of John Wesley Powell's journey down the Colorado River and his experience founding. He was the founder of the U.S. Geological Survey, and he strongly urged Congress to construct its water policy in the arid West around local control of water resources. And that's not what ended up happening. We took the other direction, and if John Wesley Powell's vision of the West had been realized, we probably would not be anywhere near the amount of trouble we're in now. If you think of cities like Las Vegas and Los Angeles and these giant metropolitan areas that don't have any sources of water anywhere around them, and that rely on these giant projects. None of that history would have taken place if people had listened to John Wesley Powell way back in the day. But of course they didn't, because he was an Enlightenment thinker, and he went against the idea that we ought to exploit all of our natural resources in order, to maximize profit, right? Like John Wesley Powell, his underlying philosophy went against the grain of the dominant culture, and so he was marginalized. So I want to make sure we leave plenty of time to talk about our. So I don't know, where are we here? Goodness gracious. So there we have our little section about Harambe. We talked about that on Wednesday. And then, you'll recall we had 4 goals at the beginning of the term for this class. And one of our goals was to understand the philosophical basis, or the larger moral philosophical narrative that supports mainstream natural resource policy in North America. And by mainstream natural resource policy, I mean this a policy which is focused on extraction of wealth from natural resources to the exclusion of any notion that natural resources have a moral status that might, like humans do, right? We wouldn't maximize profit if we were talking about human resources, right? Because humans have universal human rights, but nothing else does, right? So mainstream resource policy says let's maximize utility out of everything except humans, right? Earth is a collection of resources for humans to use, enjoy, and appreciate. So part of our goal, a smaller part, right? This is a smaller part of our goal. Our larger goal was to understand an environmental ethic which challenges mainstream resource management, right? Our larger concern has been to try to reconstruct the moral philosophical point of view championed in the work of famous environmentalists like John Muir, like Aldo Leopold, and the kind of philosophy that lies behind wilderness preservation and the Endangered Species Act, for example. All right? But lurking behind, right, we have to understand, where is mainstream natural resource policy coming from? Right? What is the underlying philosophy of right? What is the underlying view of the nature of value in natural resources? And that underlying view has been historically, right? And I think these are just meant to be historical observations about where mainstream resource management thinking originates, right? What has set up resource managers to view natural resources the way that they routinely do, right? And these are some contributions to the dominant worldview that informs resource management. Certainly Baconian science plays a very large role, right? And this is where I now regret even more than I already did, the fact that we've kind of skipped over. I didn't mean to do that. Maybe we should talk more about ecofeminism today, because really this is Carolyn Merchant's main contribution to environmental history and environmental ethics, is her identification of certain developments in the 17th century, right? In the 1600s. Remember, Francis Bacon publishes Novum Organum, in which he articulates the modern scientific method for the first, not necessarily for the first time, various parts of it had already been articulated before Francis Bacon, but he kind of is recognized as the guy that brought it all together. And so 1620, the publication of Novum Organum is often marked as the beginning of the Enlightenment, right? And yet this is one of the drawbacks of the emergence of science to the throne of knowledge, right? Science has ascended to the throne of knowledge. The Catholic Church and a lot of religious doctrine has been cast aside as being unacceptable, just not founded on reason, and we need to reject, right? And so what's left? The observation of the senses, what science can disclose to us, right? And yet it might also the scientific revolution might also entail the orphaning of morality. Morality loses its parents, right? The parents of morality in those days were still in the church, right? They had to be in the church. The idea that nature is teleological gives us an insight into what we ought to do with respect to nature, right? But along comes enlightenment, strips out the teleological basis of dominant culture's reading of nature, right? Nature is no longer teleological, right? And so what happens to moral norms regarding the natural world? They just vanish. They evaporate, right? The idea that we have any moral obligations at all to the natural world evaporates, right? We don't have, right? Remember, our basic question is, what is the nature of our moral obligations to more than human ecological wholes, right? And the Baconian scientists say we don't have any obligations because they're just things. They don't have any moral status. There's no interiority to nature, right? And so we have no obligations to the natural world, and including the climate, nothing. We have no obligations whatsoever. It's all just a thing for humans to exploit, right? And this is a cultural transformation that occurs gradually throughout the 17th century, according to Carolyn Merchant, right? And the death of nature is not a physical event. The death of nature is a metaphysical event. Or you could say, it's an epistemological event, right? The death of nature is that event whereby nature loses any sort of interiority and any sort of moral status, right? And becomes nothing more than an exterior thing, okay? And that all goes together with these Cartesian dualisms, right? The mind has moral status, and only humans have minds, right? Dogs don't have minds. And so extreme do I think about that proposition, I can hang one up from my ceiling. Just put these meat hooks up there. Poor little guy's quivering and alive. I can cut him open though, because he doesn't have a mind. And to feel pain and to have moral status. Not only to have moral status, but even just to feel pain, you have to have a mind, right? And so Descartes was okay with that, right? He would get the absolute worst possible score from, in terms of animal welfare among historical thinkers. Anyway, it's just, I don't have enough bad things to say, really. But metaphysically is what we're interested in, right? I mean, the poor Descartes, he was horribly misguided. He allowed himself to do these horrible things which will commit him to infamy in all of history, right? But metaphysically, these dualisms have captured Western society and Western culture for hundreds of years, right? Nature doesn't have an interiority. Nature doesn't have any moral status. Nature is just property. Nature is just an object. To have interiority, to have moral status, you have to have subjectivity. But there's no subjectivity in nature. It's all just an object. Right? And that rationalizes, that helps to underpin Western technological industrial exploitation of nature, right? Which all gives rise to the horrors that we experience today. Right? And all these extinction events, the destruction of the Atlas bear, etc., right? The thylacine, etc., etc. And then you add on to that capitalism. And you add on to that 20th and 21st century technological mega-machinic dominance, right? And you have a recipe for the kind of situation we observe all around us today. Which is only accelerating, and perhaps, that's where we're headed, to a future where every particle of land, air, water, wildlife has some sort of economic value, has been assigned an economic value. Okay, so I said we want to make sure that we leave plenty of time. Okay, this is the beginning of the material on ecofeminism. This is a famous painting from about 1780, I want to say. 1768, by a guy named Joseph Wright of Derby. This is featured in Carolyn Merchant's book, The Death of Nature. And she describes, she gets a lot out of this painting, right? I'm not sure if we have time to get as much out of it as we would want. But the cockatoo is up here, and this is the scientist, okay? This is the great Baconian scientist who is coldly and rationally concerned about deciphering nature, right? Unlocking the secrets of nature, has absolutely no concern with the living organism inside. And the idea, what he's doing is he's closing off the air hole at the top, right? He's putting a cork in the top of this vat, this glass jar. bell jar, whatever it's called. And then down here, he's holding a pump, which is pumping all of the air out of the bell jar. And the cockatoo will flutter around, gasp, right? Gasp for a while, and then eventually not eventually, but in short order, the cockatoo will expire, and the scientist will coldly make his observations on a piece of paper and advance the causes of science and understanding, right? But you observe some of the other people in the room, and they're not exactly thrilled the way, anyway. So, for example, okay, the painting shows a white cockatoo fluttering in panic as the air is withdrawn. One of the girls worriedly watches the fate of the bird while the other is too upset to observe, right? This one's too up. The one on the right, obviously, she's not even going to watch. And this one is really, really worried about the fate of the poor bird. But meanwhile, the scientist himself looks directly out of the picture. David Solkin suggests the subjects of the painting show the dispassionate detachment of the evolving scientific society. Individuals are concerned for each other, the father for his children, the young man for the girl, but the distress of the cockatoo elicits only careful study. To one side of the boy at the rear, the cockatoo's empty cage can be seen on the wall, and to further heighten the drama, it is unclear whether the boy is lowering the cage on the pulley to allow the bird to be replaced after the experiment, or hoisting the cage back up, certain of its occupant's death. That's that boy on the right there talking. Anyway, so we don't want to spend too much time on this, but the idea that Carolyn Merchant defends, in her book, The Death of Nature, is that in the 17th century, these various cultural events, like, for example, the publication of Nova Morgana by Francis Bacon in 1620, a whole bunch of cultural events conspired and came together to suggest that culture's understanding of the natural world had fundamentally changed. Okay? And in fact, the old unifying metaphor that Western culture had relied on to understand the world of nature, the organism, right? Nature was organismic. According to Carolyn Merchant's, and she's a historian, remember? Carolyn Merchant is a professor of history at the University of California at Berkeley. But she became famous through this larger thesis, which included this philosophical component, right, about the death of nature, this epistemological event. So she's more than a historian, right? She's also describing, she's sort of a historian of ideas, a historian of the larger structures of thought that govern Western society. Okay? And she observes that prior to the scientific revolution, nature was popularly viewed and understood as an organism. And in general, the transformation that occurred in Western society with the scientific revolution was a transformation involving that fundamental unifying metaphor of our understanding of nature. The idea that nature is an organism was replaced by the idea that nature is a machine, right? And here you should recall Uncle Aldo's discussion of nature as organism versus nature as mechanism, right? Remember, he was wrestling with that. But this is an old struggle. It goes way back, right? In the mechanical world, order was redefined to mean the predictable behavior of each part within a rationally determined system of laws, while power from an active and immediate intervention in the secularized world. Power derived from an active and immediate intervention. Order and power together constitute control, rational control over nature, society, and the self. Was achieved by redefining reality itself through the new machine metaphor. Okay? So you can kind of see how you can bet that David Watson read her work very carefully. And you can see that she gives us a deeper historical understanding of how the technological, what Watson calls the technological mega machine, began to take shape and grow, right, in the 17th century, right? So that's why we read all these people in a continuum. Social ecology, Watson's work on technology and ecofeminism, they're all kind of mining the same veins of thought and history. All right? Order and power constituted control, rational control over nature, society, and the self, right? The technological mega machine was achieved by redefining reality itself through the new machine metaphor, all right? And this is the death of nature, all right? The removal of animistic, organic assumptions about the cosmos constituted the death of nature. It's an epistemological event, an event about knowledge, right? About how Western society establishes truth claims about nature. Right? Before we established truth claims about nature with an underlying idea that nature was an organism and behaved like an organism. Now we establish truth claims about nature with the underlying assumption that nature is a mechanism. Okay? Very, very big transformation. Huge, fundamental transformation. Right? Because nature is now viewed as a system of dead, inert particles moved by external rather than inherent forces. Right? No interiority. The mechanical framework itself could legitimate the manipulation of nature. All right? Moreover, the mechanical order had associated with it a framework of values based on power, fully compatible with the directions taken by commercial capitalism. Okay? And mathematical formalism becomes the scientific ideal. All right? This is really an amazing insight into what happened. And, I think of hatchery fish versus the fisheries that the river naturally supported. Mathematical formalism. The point being made here is that when science ascended to the throne of knowledge, when mathematical formalism became the only ideal of what we know about the natural world, then hatcheries and closed systems become the ideal to which resource managers strive. Okay? The more open, adaptive, and organic the system, like those thousands of distinct salmon subspecies that made up the 30 million salmon that annually migrated up the Columbia River, right? Thousands and thousands, right? Open, adaptive, organic, right? The more open, adaptive, and organic, however, from a Baconian Cartesian scientific management point of view, the less successful we are being, right? Because we want to be formal. We want to formalize everything, systematize everything. So we have to reduce, we have to restrict, we have to homogenize, right? As managers. To achieve this ideal, we have to strip down the ecosystem. Like Procrustes in the ancient Greek legend. Procrustes announced to all of his visitors that he had a perfect bed for them to rest for the night. And they said, okay, I'll spend the night. Turned out that Procrustes' bed was the same for every visitor. And so if his visitor was too large for the bed, then Procrustes started hacking off limbs in order to make the person fit into the bed. Right? If the bed was too small, too large, right? The being who asked for being, sleep for the night was too small, that person stretch him way out, right, to make him fit the bed. So anyway, yeah, that metaphor, the Procrustean bed, when you encounter, that's what they're talking about, right? And so the point being made here is that mathematical formalism forces nature onto a Procrustean bed, right? Just starts hacking off certain essential properties and characteristics of nature in order to force nature to fit mechanistic assumptions about her, about nature, or him. Increasingly, right? And this pushes us increasingly in the direction of artificial environments, right? Like hatchery technology, hatchery systems, rather than natural rivers. Even though the hatchery, right? The hatcheries that we have now are pale, right? It's just ridiculous. They don't even, right? If there was a Super Bowl, then the natural river systems would demolish, right, the hatchery systems in terms of salmon production, right? The river is far better at producing salmon than human beings are in their stupid hatcheries. But even though that's the case, they're still going to insist that because the hatchery system conforms to the scientific ideal, it is to be preferred, right? And so mechanistic assumptions about nature push the resource manager increasingly in the direction of artificial environments, mechanized control over more and more aspects of human life, and a loss of the quality of life itself. All right? And my favorite example, of course, hatchery-based fisheries versus natural fisheries. All right? So the death of nature is when what happens when nature as organism, conceptually, metaphorically, is replaced by nature as mechanism. Okay? The order of the organism, Earth as a nurturing mother, is replaced by the order disclosed by modern science, Earth as a dead mechanism, right? And when power and control are the salient virtues to which humans ought to strive, then being powerful and in control, being a badass among humans, right, is the #1 virtue, right? And from an ecofeminist point of view, this is horribly misguided and potentially disastrous, right? Because Earth as a nurturing mother, right? Thinking of Earth as a nurturing mother is, whether you're badass or not, right? It's still a virtue to be nurturing. In any event, one of my pet peeves is we live in a testosterone-drenched culture, don't we? And that's part of what Carolyn Merchant is, if you read between the lines of what she's written for us, it seems to be one thing that she's pointing out, that with the scientific revolution, we kind of get a society that's dominated by this notion of control, right? It's the human role to control, to conquer, right? And so the dominant society is somehow historically indisposed to making the kind of move that Leopold recommends, right? Humankind, Leopold instructs, is obligated now, out of necessity, ecological necessity, to begin conceiving itself and conducting itself as a plain citizen of a biotic community, right? And no longer a conqueror. And yet, right, we have that conquering mentality just written into the very logic of history, right? And that's what Carolyn Merchant is pointing out to us, right? The very logic of Earth as a mechanism is for humans to be dominators, right? And so, anyway, an organically oriented, and this would be the alternative, right? An organically oriented mentality in which female principles played an important role was undermined and replaced by a mechanically oriented mentality that either eliminated or used female principles in an exploitive manner. As Western culture became increasingly mechanized in the 1600s, the female Earth and virgin Earth spirit were subdued by the machine. All right? And this exactly is the death of nature. All right? And then we don't read Vanda Mishiva. We haven't for a while in my class, but she's great if you want to read Vanda Mishiva. She's much more political. So, anyway, goodness gracious. We've already gone way over time. So you want to take a 3-minute break? Come back at 10 minutes after 1, okay? And then we'll spend a little bit of time on Stegner, and that's all. And then we'll break up into groups. Okay, and that's all we'll do is we'll spend a little bit of time on Stegner, and then we'll call it wraps. And I've got your course evaluations to fill out too.
I was like,
have you abandoned that?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Just make sure you meet with them. No, you guys will get together right now.
I have one aware of
Thank you. Sure.
I just need to get shoes.
Don't be
But I don't like But I really could just.
well, it's like,
Yeah, I have a backup plan, yeah.
Well, you'll have to organize people, right? I mean, you're the main team leader for the environmentalists. But you're lucky because you have 2 other leaders underneath you who you could easily delegate a lot of the work to, right? Which you will.
yeah.
Centric environmentalists. And those guys are going to do a lot of work organizing, right? The anthropocentric environmentalist coordinator probably has the most work of all, just in terms of volume of work, because, right, your anthropocentric is like that. Whatever you do at hearing. You know what I mean? So that's why that person, we know whose name that is. That's my kombucha. I kept it in the, I didn't refrigerate it, actually. Still tastes really good.
You alright?
Tastes really good.
You're not gonna explore too, are you? That would be scary.
That's kind of what I heard, but like we have to leave Yeah. Which means you need to like be there to actually show up.
Yeah. Like in, well, it was like, I don't know, it's just like a really, like he was accessible. Like everybody knew him because he was just like really arrogant. But his daughter,
I shaved it for the first time in 3 years. Wow. Like, and yeah, almost
okay, because I liked the other signs way better. I think it's got like, we had 2 signs which I don't pay. And so the guy that died was like the chemistry teacher, and the other guy was just a biology teacher. Bird watching. Yeah, he's like really into bird watching, so we bought it.
Where'd he go?
I'm just throwing it.
Yeah, I was in my school, like, they just like, it was like, we got on like Arrow Farm, and like, we're Spanish, and like English, history, that was it. Except that we had like, step but we didn't have like any, like, anything else other than the basics that wasn't step. So it's like, why?
All right.
Like, it's good, but like, we didn't have any art.
The attendance sheet for this last week. Just sign yourself in for Tuesday too if you were here on Tuesday. So we have this, environmental ethics last little bit to cover, I guess, and I just wish we had a lot more time.